with Delta naturalists for quite a while. You may recall that Deborah did a presentation on rain gardens way back in December 2009. But a lot has happened since then. So she'll be bringing us up to date on all the great things that have been happening in the rain gardens for salmon area. Deborah has a BA in Urban Studies and a Master of Library Science and worked for the Vancouver Public Library for over 30 years. She and her husband joined the Cougar Creek Streamkeepers in 2004 after noticing illegal tree cutting on the banks of the most productive salmon stream in North Delta. They put their gardening experience to work on a restoration planting project along that stream bank. That project led to another and another and another and another. And Deborah now serves as a volunteer rain gardens coordinator for the Streamkeepers and oversees the maintenance of 29 school and community rain gardens created since 2006, in collaboration with the City of Delta, the Delta School District, Civic Salmon Foundation, Nature Trust of BC, and others. She also advises the Nature Trust on the Rain Garden Grant Program. And the thing I found really neat about this when I was looking at the website was to see all of the school children with their rain gardens. I mean, that's pretty cool. So I'll turn it over to Deborah and let her bring us up to speed on what's been happening with rain gardens and how that helps salmon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks very much for inviting me. Can you all hear? Is everything okay that way?
Sounds good.
Radio's in the background. Good, okay. Yes, I'm very happy to be here, and Jim and I practiced sharing my screen. So without further ado, I'll click share screen and see if I can get my slideshow up.
There we go.
Oops.
There we go.
That looks good.
That looks good. Okay, good. As Elizabeth said, I did give a rain garden talk for the Delta Nats in 2009. I thought it was much more recent. So when I was asked to come again, I said, but didn't I just do that? But no, it was 11 and a half years ago. And here are the two beautiful flyers. I wish I had a tenth of this kind of artistic talent. This second one here is the confluence of Blake Creek and Lower Cougar Creek. So very appropriate. A couple of background things. In 1999, I stumbled upon this newspaper article, Beware the Killer Pavement. It changed the way I looked at landscapes, especially, of course, urban landscapes and suburban landscapes. So I'm hoping that for those of you who are not already familiar with this topic, it may also change your way of looking at the landscape. And again, in the way of background, just to kind of give you a bit of orientation, I know we're somewhat in separate worlds from Ladner, Tsawwassen, and North Delta. Here's Highway 91 and the Alex Fraser Bridge. Cougar Creek rises in Surrey, on the Surrey side of Scott Road, and there's still remnants of the creek in the form of various bits of ditches and so on. But it drains a very large watershed here on the Surrey side, and then flows in across Scott Road into North Delta through a beautiful canyon, and then northward to the Fraser River. So that's the salmon migration route. For quite a long time, the creek was actually dead because it had originally flowed southwest and out to Boundary Bay. And during all of the building of railroads and sewer lines and highways and so on, that route got closed off, and this was created probably sometime in about the 70s. It's to some extent a natural waterway, but it was dredged and so on and made into Lower Cougar Creek. Although for a long time it was called the Northwest Interceptor Canal, and it still is a main drainage route. And we have one major tributary here. So during that period, fish couldn't find their way back, and one of our stream keepers for 20 years operated an incubator box where he incubated eggs with spring water running across them to keep them oxygenated. And he incubated eggs down at the lower end of Cougar Canyon. And we think those are the ancestors of our present wild run of wild coho. We do also stock chum, but the real success has been the wild coho run. It's small. We'd like to build it to about 500 spawners. At the moment, it tends to be around 225, 230 spawners each fall. So, rain gardens for salmon. There are 3 sections to my little presentation here. What do gardens have to do with salmon? A look at some of the rain gardens that we've done as streamkeepers in collaboration with various people, and then some ideas for creating your own rain gardens, things that are really simple, that don't require a lot of work, a lot of excavation. What we can do is, depending on how you feel about it, we could stop after each one of these sections and have a bit of discussion or questions or whatever. It's up to you how you feel about it. I should warn that the presentation is very dense with slides, color photos that have text on them. I need to whip through pretty quickly in order not to keep you too late, but you will have a recording of the presentation, and also the presentation is pretty well self-guiding even without sound because of the text on the slides. So what in the world do gardens have to do with salmon? Well, water is life, life is water. Our bodies of all living things are mostly water. And yet, amazingly, at any given time, less than 1% of Earth's water is accessible fresh water. And there's more than that of fresh water, but it's wrapped up in polar ice caps and glaciers, which of course are now melting into the salt chuck. So, how can this tiny percentage of water keep all us terrestrial freshwater loving things going? It's quite amazing. Well, nature has worked on the system for a long time, and you're no doubt all familiar with it, but just to summarize, the sun, it's a solar powered system, evaporates water from the ocean where most of our water is. So that's water vapor. It forms clouds that come out over the land. Those clouds drop their moisture in the form of precipitation, rain, snow, and so on. And gradually that water works its way back out to the oceans, and so on and so on. The part that we are interested in this evening is what happens after the rain falls and before it reaches the ocean. So here's what nature does with that water. Rain falls down. A lot of it never reaches the ground, especially if it's above a forest. It'll hit that tree canopy and be stuck up in the tree canopy. That's why we stay dry under a tree when it's raining. So that water may slowly drip to the ground, but a lot of it will evaporate back into the atmosphere. What does hit the ground soaks gradually in through a nice cushion of forest duff, needles, twigs, dead insect bodies, and so on. And of course, the plants will take up what they need, and insects will take what they need, worms will take what they need, and so on. And again, that's back up into the tree, and trees breathe just the way we do. They transpire, and they're transpiring out moisture all the time. So the combined moisture coming out of evaporation and transpiration is evapotranspiration, and it hasn't been getting nearly the credit it deserves for keeping our climate cool, at least at the local level. No matter what the carbon content of the atmosphere is, if you are around trees, even if you're around grass, standing on grass instead of on a pavement, evapotranspiration, that water evaporating, that's a solar powered air conditioner, changing liquid water to water vapor. So it has a very cooling impact. It's also important in the case of trees for interior rain, because there's so much water evaporating and transpirating from trees that nature can form new clouds, which blow farther inland, and you get this leapfrogging effect. So if you log all your West Coast old growth forest, you can create drier conditions farther east, because there simply isn't that evapotranspiration going on to form new cloud cover. So back to the question at hand, there's always excess water that things don't take up, and that soaks into the ground. It's called groundwater, and gradually it flows downhill to some body of water. It may emerge on a slope, in which case it's a spring, or it emerges right into a creek or lake or shoreline or whatever. So in effect, natural landscapes are like a huge sponge soaking up this water slowly. The landscapes store the water in the ground for free as groundwater. You don't need to build a dam or a reservoir. And the land gradually releases any excess into low-lying bodies of water and ultimately the ocean. So groundwater that's formed here may reach a creek very quickly. Groundwater that's formed back here may take months to reach a creek. So this seepage is just incredibly important in providing a steady supply of filtered water to everything: springs, wetlands, lakes, creeks, rivers. And I'm sure you're all familiar with these wonderful skunk cabbages, which here are growing in a seepage in the lowest part of Cougar Canyon. The slopes are dry, but that seepage is emerging here, and I couldn't resist. These are such wonderful prehistoric looking plants, aren't they? They're beautiful. And of course, this clear water filtered by soil. This is Cougar Canyon water, Cougar Creek water. So when we start to develop land, we start to change its ability to absorb water. In forest land, essentially everything, 50% is evapotranspiration, cooling us down and forming new clouds. And there's shallow and deep groundwater infiltration. The shallow being 1 to 2 meters deep and the deeper being deeper. As soon as we cut down trees, even if we keep something in pasture, we start getting this red line. That's the water that is becoming a nuisance. It's sitting on the surface. It can't soak in. We've compacted the soil. We've removed the canopy that softens the flow of the downfall of rain. So we're getting this runoff. As we suburbanize, we get more runoff, and the bad news, here we are in a place like downtown Vancouver, very little evapotranspiration, and all the rest, we've turned it from a resource into runoff, that is wastewater that we have to do something with. So here's how that process happens. We end up, cutting down all the trees, replacing the sponge with buildings, rooftops, pavements, and so on that can't soak up water. They're impervious. And that's what's creating that enormous amount of red water, nuisance water that we don't know what to do with. Here we are in Tsawwassen with relatively small, but look at the contrast of all of this gray impervious with areas that are more natural. So what do we do with all that water? It won't soak into the ground. So we install drains. There are drains from roofs. There are drains in streets. There are drains in parking lots and gas stations. And here's a drain that may be familiar to some of you. This is at the corner, the big intersection next to Petra's. So if you're going birding, you can have a look at this from Petra's. You can have a look at this storm drain here, and that's where rainwater runoff goes. We don't have time to mark every drain with a fish. I used to wonder before I was a streamkeeper, so the drains that aren't marked with a fish, do they go to the sewage plant and get treated? No, it's just we don't have enough time to mark every drain. All of these drains empty into fish habitat somewhere. It could be a creek, river, lake, or a shoreline. Now I can see why engineers did this in the past. It was kind of convenient, and really it wasn't a big issue because we had gravel shoulders and we had a lot of ditches. Development was kind of a more casual affair, but there were large gardens, so we could get a lot of rainwater absorbed and filtered in the ground. But now we have these new development standards. It's really since the 70s, 80s, especially, I would say the 80s. That are kind of a Procrustean bed. Everybody must have, curbs, and everybody must have a certain number of storm drains. Even when there's space to soak water in the ground, we don't do it. We build to the standards. And of course, we're leaving a lot less space. This is a house just in our neighborhood, one of probably 7 or 8 humongous new houses. And not only do they sprawl sideways, they also sprawl into the ground, deep into the ground. This one is a multifamily apartment building, but we're excavating and trucking away that free storage and filtration system, which is the soil. So what happens is you get an enormous volume of piped drainage. I'm sure that White Rock has rectified this by now. This is an old photo, but when your drains are oversubscribed by too much water running off them, you need to replace with bigger pipes. Otherwise you get a geyser exploding out of your storm drains. This, of course, is driven by gravity because White Rock has slopes, and those slopes are feeding water at great pressure down pipes and into storm drains. From the pipes, that water flows into creeks or maybe into Boundary Bay or a Geluctan Slough, wherever you might happen to be. And again, the pipes start to get oversubscribed. These two pipes here are, this is Cougar Creek coming from Surrey, and this is the storm drain coming from Scott Road and Scottsdale Mall. So you get a lot of erosion, destruction of fish habitat, sediments dumped on top of eggs or eggs washed out. You get flooding hazard. There are no urban floods that don't have an urban, stormwater management component. That is a component of we're sealing off the ground and we're piping all this water, and sometimes the system just can't take it. But within a few hours, of course, all that rainwater has raced out to the ocean, whether it's straight through a pipe that empties into the ocean or whether it's via a creek. That water hasn't soaked into the ground. So it's as if you spent your entire allowance the first day you got it, and you're left with nothing. And that's our biggest problem in Cougar Creek, I would say, is summer drought, because more and more precious winter rains are being piped away. So we've got this drought. You can imagine trying to be a small fry, a coho fry or a chum fry. Chum don't stay in the summer. A coho fry, trying to find a cool pond to shelter in and deep enough to hide from predators. We have lots of herons, we've got mallards, we've got otters, we've got everything, looking for crayfish, looking for a tasty fry. There's too little groundwater to give thirsty trees a drink. We have a lot of cedar dieback, which is exacerbated by lack of groundwater recharge. So that's the water quantity problem. I originally got into the rain gardens thinking about the water quality problem, the pollution. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We should be having only rain down the drain, but it's a pipe dream because we're never going to educate everybody to be careful enough not to have this stuff going down drains. This spill, I took this photo today. On Lower Cougar Creek, and this spill has been going since yesterday, and Delta still hasn't been able to figure out where it's coming from. The sediment plume goes 150 meters and more down Lower Cougar Creek. Fortunately, we're downstream from our main coho fry area, so they won't suffer the gill clogging effects of these sediments because they're mostly upstream. Did anyone happen to see this in the news? This was just a couple of days ago, a few days ago. Abbotsford, people observed these soap suds in the creek. How did they get there? Well, some local development wanted their roofs cleaned, and the cleaner used soap suds. And of course, all of that washed down our drainage system. Tire and brake dust are a major thing, and especially tire dust. For 20 years, scientists in Seattle have been working on trying to figure out what is killing coho salmon pre-spawn. It's called pre-spawn mortality. The coho arrive healthy in a creek and then they keel over and die before they can spawn. And apparently it's a preservative that's universally used in tires around the world. And that tire dust interacts with water and creates a chemical that kills coho. So all of this stuff is flowing into our creeks. And here's a summary of the situation. We've got all these impervious areas, all this polluted runoff. We get this flashiness. Oh, we get a waste of water. We don't get the water soaking into the ground. We get flashiness. Either there's too much water or too little water. We get pollution. We get destruction of salmon spawning and rearing habitat. And of course, all of this is going to become worse if we get these heavier winter rains and longer summer dry spells that we are told will be associated with climate change in our region. So instead of piping all of this away, What if we rearrange the landscape and get that water back into areas of soil and plants the way nature would have done before we built our cities? That's what a rain garden is. It's a garden that receives not only water that falls in onto it from the sky, but also rainwater runoff from an impervious surface like a pavement or a roof. And here are some examples. You will often see curb cuts with these metal plates over them. We're at the bottom of what's actually quite a steep street. So lots of runoff comes roaring down that street and into this garden. Here, low heat highway, median landscaping, same idea, these metal plates over the curb so cars can't drive in by accident, but there's an opening and water can get in. If we ever get to Peace Arch again, one of these years, you can have a look at the Canada Customs southbound equipment co-op is using roof water, comes down these roof downspouts and then through trench drains in the sidewalk and into their perimeter landscaping. Every company has to have some kind of perimeter landscaping. So, hey, make it do double duty. The landscaping will be happier for getting that water too. South Surrey Rec Center has done something artistic with their roof water. They got kind of a plunge pool here. It's very dramatic when it rains. Also in South Surrey, Surrey had just kind of an ugly detention pond for rainwater where the water would go into a big grass pit with chain link fence around it. And the locals got together with Surrey and they turned it into a park. There you're using your rainwater runoff as a resource. Many rain gardens are done with a curb-free street. That only works where you don't have too much traffic, light traffic, and the water just flows, as you can see these streaks across that concrete strip. And here's the same stretch some years later, looking uphill, and you can see how well it has grown in over the years. As you say, things grow like crazy when they have this extra water. We really don't appreciate the abundance of nature till we start adding water and stirring, and whoa, it's quite amazing. Anyone recognize where this one is? I don't know if Jim has set it up so you can press down your space bar and shout it out. Well, if he hasn't, there it is. This is at Tsawwassen Mills. In their back parking lot, you can find rain gardens. I must say that river rock is held to weed. I would never put river rock in a rain garden, but you see it a lot. But basically, the engineering idea of this is fine. It needs a bit of maintenance, a bit of lowering of built up sediments, maybe some more planting, but it's nicely done. How about this one? Anyone recognize this one? Is anyone able to shout out? Maybe you can't. This is in Civic Center. Municipal Hall is just down here where my cursor is, and to the right is the parking lot in front of Municipal Hall. And here it's curb cut from the parking lot and another one from the street. How about this one? This may be closer to home for those in Ladner. This is the Mckee Senior Center. And in addition to pavers that allow water to soak through them, water can also come off the pavement and into this swale, which has an emergency overflow drain. More about that later. And even a grass swale is a rain garden. This one is also in Ladner Civic Center, and it has intakes from the street and from the parking lot. This is near the police station there, or police offices or whatever. Now I'd like to take a brief digression about these preceding four examples. You'll often hear people say, rain gardens, they don't work in low-lying areas where the groundwater table is high. They are indeed feasible in these areas. And if you look at old parts of Ladner or Beech Grove, you'll see many places where there were not storm drains, there were streets without curbs, and the water, yes, it got a little muddy on the edge, but there was not flooding. It is feasible in low-lying areas with high water tables. You have to be more careful than in a high area like North Delta, but you can do it. And in fact, Ian Payton, who at the time was a counselor, pointed out at one of the school rain garden plantings at Hellings Elementary that allowing water to soak in an area like Ladner may actually reduce saltwater intrusion. And it also may reduce coastal land subsidence, which happens when you dry out your coasts. So that ocean rise is not just a function of more water in the ocean, it's also a function of the land subsiding. And that happens when you dry out that land. So here's a diagram of this very, very oversimplified diagram. This is hugely, hugely complex, but just to get the idea that if you saturate your land with fresh water, you've got more pressure up against the salt water that's trying to intrude. So to summarize this, we're almost at the end of this section. Rain gardens are meant to mimic the forests and the wetlands that used to be here. This one takes water from 72nd Avenue and parking lot. They soak up runoff, they replenish the groundwater supplies, so they reduce drought stress to trees and creeks and the salmon that live in those creeks. You'll often see a storm drain in a rain garden, but it'll be raised if it's built right. It's got a raised lip there, and that's to allow the water to pool because it's only for overflow water. You don't want to get too much water for safety hazard. So you want to let the water pool if you can. Rain gardens delay or even prevent rainwater from entering pipes and creeks. So that's really a help for reducing flooding, erosion, fish habitat destruction. You're putting that water into nature's free reservoir instead. You get a lot of cleansing in a rain garden. You can't see here, but this trench drain heads out to busy 72nd Avenue, where on a rainy day, cars are stopped to let school kids cross the street. They are idling, and the rain is taking that, the byproducts of idling, flowing it right off the street and straight into the rain garden. The plants don't seem to mind at all, but let me tell you, a fish would not like this. Rain gardens are also a way of beautifying our communities. Many of the rain gardens, well, all the rain gardens were done where there was just a lawn or some blacktop or whatever. So they certainly look much nicer. We've got fresh air, we've got habitat, carbon storage, cooling shade, evapotranspiration. These are like little mini parks. And finally, rain gardens, we always provide a interpretive sign. They show a way that we can all help to conserve water and protect our environment, especially our salmon, and green our communities. So that was part one. Now I'm going to ask Audrey or Elizabeth, did you want me to stop and have a bit of chat? Or would you like to move along briskly, since this is such a dense presentation? I'm not daring to look at the chat, because if I do, I might not know how to get back to my presentation. So I'll rely on anyone else to look and see if there was any pressing question in the chat.
I think you should carry on.
Okay, I'll do that.
Because what I see in the chat is you're explaining it, what constitutes a rain garden. So
yeah, and I realize for some people, maybe for many people, this is total repetition, and I apologize for that. But on the other hand, it's great to build it up from square one for people who are not familiar with this at all. And I meet so many people just on the street who, I was one of those. I had never given a thought to where the rain goes. But yes, thank you. Okay, I will continue. So here's some examples of rain gardens, and probably at that first presentation, I showed our first rain garden, the one that had been done in 2006. And we had asked Delta Engineering if we could collaborate on some kind of rainwater infiltration. When my husband and I were working on a restoration site, we saw that it would start to rain and the creek would go from 6 inches deep, pardon the non-metric, 6 inches to 6 feet deep, just, like in half an hour. And we realized it was this filthy runoff from Scottsdale Mall. That's the same mall where the gentleman was shot the other day, Scott Road, and all of these other places, which, by the way, used to be Scott Lake before they were before the beaver ponds were dynamited in 1928 and the area drained. In any event, we asked if we could collaborate. Hugh Fraser, an engineer, suggested the Cougar Canyon Elementary School parking lot, and so we began to collaborate on that. His idea was, instead of a solid curb and a couple of storm drains catching all the water from this sloping 2-row parking lot, we'll have curb cuts and make a rain garden in this area here. And here's Sarah Howie, Delta's designer of so many of the rain gardens. Everybody seemed to be on board. And this is our dog, Lawrence. We got a Pacific Salmon Foundation grant for the plants and materials. Delta did the excavation, the earthwork, the drainage modifications. They planted the big trees. Joan Carn from Stream of Dreams, the people who do the fish on fences, she explained to every single class the importance of what their rain garden would be accomplishing for fish. And this corridor right here across the street is the banks of Cougar Canyon. So it was very clear for the kids that this was directly relevant to their creek and their school. Now, we had never had any intention of working with kids, to be honest. But because the school was right there, we thought, well, let's have them do the planting. And it was a great experience, and it was a very smart thing to do in hindsight. We did it almost by accident, but it worked out really well. It brought so much community engagement. Here you see the garden just a few years old and then getting a little bit more mature. And I don't know if you can see the wheel stops here. These are the 2 storm drains in the parking lot were sealed off. The wheel stops allow water to pass through and into the garden area, and that's that. So it was very popular with the public, and that meant mayor and council liked it too. And Mayor Jackson at the time was actually very supportive, and mayor and council decided that they would aim to have a rain garden at every elementary school in North Delta. So here is former Mayor Jackson, and here's the smallest rain garden at Richardson Elementary School. Just a teeny tiny little space. Sarah Howie, the designer, reused this existing storm drain as the overflow drain. There it is. And she very cleverly designed a kind of contorted route for water to sit and stand and flow before it ever reached that drain. Sometimes you'll see rain gardens designed where the water comes in and it just shoots down the overflow drain, which misses the entire point. Sarah was very clever about that, and it's been a super successful rain garden, a very small one, but very well sized to the parking lot. I'm sorry, these photos don't show the size of what it's draining, but it's probably about 7 times the size of the rain garden. Here's the largest rain garden. This is in a hydro corridor shortly after planting. You see it here. Here's the hydro corridor. This school roof generates 5 million liters of rainwater runoff per year, half of which goes this way, and the other half we think goes in the other direction. In any event, that water used to go through a storm sewer and join up with the city storm mains and into Blake Creek, our Cougar Creek tributary. The idea was, let's put it into a rain garden in that corridor. Here's the route that water would take to Blake Creek. And of course, that sewer would pick up rainwater from everywhere else. So our idea was, forget that, let's soak the water into here. And they accomplished that by diverting that pipe into what would become the rain garden here, leaving this pipe in place should it ever be needed in future if the rain garden were overwhelmed by the amount of water coming in. But it hasn't been overwhelmed. It's done really well. Here's the water coming into the entrance chamber, pre-planting. Planting was like a military operation. Delta's gardeners joined in. There were kids galore and teachers, and although just one class at a time. Yeah, it was a fun scene. The older kids did the mulching with big buckets. The little kids did the mulching with little buckets. Little kids can demolish a pile like this in no time flat. You wouldn't believe, half an hour, 40 minutes, and they've mulched an entire garden. And that mulch is so important because it imitates the forest duff, which is how the forest also receives water onto the forest floor and soaks it in. Whereas if you don't have this mulch, you can get a baked surface and have water running off the way it runs off a clear cut. A city and a clear cut behave kind of the same way. Too much water just runs right off. And because we couldn't plant trees, because it's a hydro corridor, we decided we'll do more like a pollinator style garden, lots of flowers, some native, some not native. There's yarrow. This is a, what is it that the monarchs eat? However, this is probably not the one they eat, and I don't know that we get monarchs. That's it, yes. Asters, spireas, threadleaf coreopsis, and so on. It's a mix of cultivars and natives. I'll come to that in a moment. This is, again, yarrow, good native. So there have been all sizes and shapes in between. You've seen our first one, our smallest one, our largest one, and I'll just show you a few more. You might ask yourself, what's a rain garden doing in a park? What exactly is it draining? Well, this is a case where the park has a lot of natural drainage in it, like natural springs in this particular park, and they were draining the water away because this was a lawn and that water was a nuisance. And so the idea was to close off the uphill of the drains. There's a lower one down here serving for overflow, and let that water go. Let that water be in the park. So that's exactly what we did. Delta did all of this earthwork and so on. And then secondary kids planted this garden, which is doing a wonderful job and growing ever more luxuriant. And what we tried to do was feather the natural landscape into more of a garden landscape. So we've got the Douglas spireas were there, the snowberries were there, the poplars were there. We've added the Carex of nupta, the native sluice sedge. We've got, for color, a different type of spirea that brightens things up. We've got a potentilla that's not the native, but it's quasi-native. We have the native creeping Oregon grape, Mahonia repens, a non-native pine, and so on. Gibson Elementary School rain garden takes all the runoff from the school roundabout and a bit from the street as well that's up the driveway. Northside Church rain garden, and this one drains a huge parking lot where the church kids have a car wash every summer, every non-COVID summer. And that water used to go down this, which was a parking space. The kids jackhammered up the parking space themselves because this was church property, not city property, created this wonderful garden. And now the soap suds go past what is now a raised drain and soak into this area here. It works really well. Pinewood is a mostly native plant rain garden. People often ask about that. Often when you see advice about rain gardens, it's, plant natives. And I greet that with a bit of, my reaction is mixed. Yes, absolutely. Natives are great. Sometimes they're too much work. So I'm not sure. I don't think this particular dogwood is a native. This potentilla isn't a native. Mahonia repens, creeping Oregon grape is a native. The aster is a native. The sword ferns are native. The lupins are native. The coastal strawberries are native. This particular plant here is a variegated dogwood, which is not native, but if you've ever worked in a garden with a creek dogwood, red osier dogwood, they run rampant. They are huge. They just are not suited to this application. So we simply had to use a different type of plant. We originally actually had salal here and it all died. Salal can be really difficult to get going. A native iris. And this one down here might interest you. Oh, and this here, recently the First Nations wanted to have a cedar tree, a giving cedar planted at every school in Delta. And the problem is finding wet enough places. So the school district and the city have just recently enlarged the rain garden perimeter to encompass this cedar tree in hopes that it will be wet enough for that cedar to survive. And this plant, this is the blow up of these guys down here. Anyone recognize this one? We've had it in the garden for 6 years, I think. The garden was done in 2015, I think. Never any action out of it. I thought it was just never going to do anything. This is what it is, the common camas. Maybe last year's wood chip mulch was from Gary oak trees, I don't know, and it suddenly felt at home. Normally this grows on Vancouver Island, but we're really thrilled this year to have camas. I include this one just because it shows, again, a roof downspout rain garden. This downspout used to go straight into the storm sewer that went into Cougar Creek, and now it goes into a series of channels that guide it around this garden. There was some landscaping here, and the secondary kids have really improved on it. And last one, Tidewater's rain garden underneath the Alex Fraser Bridge. It's taking rainwater from the roof of Tidewater's pub, the parking lot, and also a pipe from the bridge, a downspout from the bridge, and you would not believe the filth that comes off that bridge. So now I'm starting to think, what in the heck goes down into the Fraser River from bridges that cross it? At least in the old days, I think they just let her rip with the water straight down, cigarette butts galore. It's really pretty filthy. But in any event, all of the cattails volunteered. They saw all that water and they moved right in. This garden is 7, 8 years old, and there are Douglas firs and cedars that are now 15 feet tall down at this other end. We didn't put them at this end so they wouldn't block the pub signage. And this is what it looked like to start with. So it's amazing when, as I said, when you just add water and stir, you get this unbelievable growth. The engineers were blown away when they saw this just recently, that this much growth had occurred on what was a wasteland. Create your own rain gardens. Well, we don't all have access to backhoes and staff and so on, but there's so many simple things we can do to use some of our roof runoff, our driveway runoff, if we have a ditch, and if we're feeling more ambitious, there are more ambitious things we can do. So these small projects can have quite an impact. For ease of calculation, let's say that all of Delta gets 1,000 millimeters or 1 meter of precipitation. It's less in Tsawwassen, about that in Ladner, more in North Delta. So how much rainwater per year do you get for every square meter of surface? Well, if you get a meter by a meter, square meter, plus a meter deep, that's a cubic meter of water. And there's 1,000 liters in a cubic meter of water. So for every square meter of your property, you are receiving 1,000 liters of rainwater per year. If it's falling into your garden, it's soaking into the ground most likely, but if it's falling on your driveway or your roof, it's most likely being piped away into salmon habitat somewhere, whether it's a shoreline or a slough or a stream or whatever. So just as an example, here's our house, 235 square meters. And this is how many liters of rain we received just on the roof alone, not counting the driveway. So we have 6 downspouts, and we've disconnected all of those and run them into the garden. We're fortunate it's a safe situation, and you'll see a bit of that later. So it's such a great resource for our gardens and for replenishing groundwater. So the easiest thing to do is disconnect a roof downspout. And I hope, and just existing plantings, I hope this is going to work for you with the sound. So this is just to show that although there's quite a bit of water coming down, it's just soaking into that sponge. We're not creating a flood. When you work with water, you begin to kind of have a sense of what you can safely do. And there are ways to test what you can safely do. So other things you might see are people dropping that water onto a splash pad, sending it out to a lawn, using one of these extenders. You can buy them at any garden home improvement store like Rona Home Depot, and you can string them together in series if you want to get the water quite far away from your house. You can do a drain chain if you want something more decorative and put a pot of stones at the bottom to dissipate the force. You can use a rain barrel and either run the overflow hose back into your what's called drain tiles or the perimeter drainage that's around your foundation, the footings of your foundation, and that goes into the storm sewer system. Or in our case, we ran the overflow into a fern garden. In this case, we decided, oh, let's create a tripping hazard and just run the overflow into our rhododendrons. But the rhodos love it, and no one's tripped badly yet. So safety first. Cities are always very concerned about liability, especially water liability. So they shouldn't be allowing these deep in-ground basements we're getting. But rain gardens aren't suitable on or close to a steep slope. So if you're on English Bluff, maybe draining water towards the street, but I would not drain it back towards English Bluff. Make sure there's a safe overflow route that's not going to end up like in your basement or your neighbor's basement or even your neighbor's backyard. If you're in doubt, you can use a hose to see where the water will go. You want a good ratio. You don't want to overwhelm your garden. So 5 to 1 is ample in North Delta, 5 parts roof, 1 part garden. And as you saw in those previous examples, we didn't replant anything. We didn't dig anything. All we did was put the water out into existing landscaping. You can use splash pad rocks or whatever to keep the water from eroding things as it lands. And the larger and more established your plants, the safer your rain garden will be. So here's an example of a safe situation. We have a downspout. We have an established front garden that slopes away to the street. I can tell you there's not even a sidewalk on the street. But if the garden can absorb the roof runoff fast enough, although I'm sure it can given the size, excess will flow to the street gutter and down the nearest storm drain. You could add a few more plants right in here to increase the absorption. Here's another similar situation. You've got your downspout and you've got an area here where the water can go, and then sidewalk and street. On this side, just street immediately. Add a few more plants, enlarge your planter area, and you're done. You can use your creativity to make a situation safer, running things longer. I love this one. And here's a real life example. This is a downspout emptying here. We've got a cedar tree here that's starting to show the thinning of the canopy. That means it's getting short of water. But you don't really want to empty the water right here because you got these wooden steps and you got your barbecue and so on. What are you going to do? Well, can you get the water over to here with an extended roof gutter or one of those plastic extenders? So run a hose over there, see what happens. Run the hose for 20 minutes, see what happens with the water, where the water pools, what goes on. How can we make it work? And I think we can make it work. We haven't done it yet. This is a house in a friend's house in Surrey, but they have a lot of old tree roots here that are all jumbled up. They really don't need these slabs here. They could use wood chips. They've got a broken tile here. It's really not needed. If you removed it, more water could spread this way and under the tree. So there are ways to do this. And it's kind of fun to be able to imagine it and to play with it. If you have a big driveway, you are producing a lot of water. People often complain to the city, your street water is flooding my garage. Well, often the driveway itself is flooding the garage if the driveway is above the garage and going down to the garage. But if in the right situation, you can put a little speed bump and divert that water into garden or porous gravel parking strip. Here, Delta has done this on the street into our ditch. You could do a simple curb cut I don't have an example from a house, but if there's a curb in front of your house and the way your lawn or garden is, you may just be able to cut out a chunk of curb with the city's permission and flow the water in. Here we were lucky to have a crew of secondary kids to remove the grass. And just again to show the magic of water, these 3 trees, all planted at the same time, about 2 years before this picture was taken, all of them the same species, Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the dawn redwood, rediscovered in China in 48 or something like that, 1948. And this one near the curb cut is flourishing. This one still in the rain garden, but at the very bottom end, not doing very well. And this one even smaller. So the water is the magic. It's so exciting to work with extra water. And we're getting to the end. Thanks for hanging in there with me. You can naturescape a ditch if you happen to have one. You don't want to block the flow of water. You just want to slow it down, make the ditch look good, create some habitat, and of course, check in with your local government engineering department. So this is what we did with our ditch and our neighbor's ditch on Fairlight Crescent. People were clamoring to have it closed in because it was just full of blackberries and reed canary grass. It was horrible. This is as we just began to do it. And it still looks roughly like this today. So no one clamors to fill it in anymore. And if you filled it in, what would it become? A parking strip. And these are just little scenes from the ditch, little vignettes. And again, a mixture, native, quasi-native, geranium sanguineum, and it's not the native, but it's kind of related. Sword ferns, native, and so on. And it's easy to get the water in, and it's easy to have an emergency overflow because ditches are usually just parts of a linear system that's piped. You've got a pipe feeding into it and a pipe feeding out of it. And if the engineers had their way, the whole thing would be in a pipe. So here we've got what's essentially like a daylighted stream. It's the same process as daylighting a stream, is to keep an opening of ditch where you're having natural processes happen. I happened to be in West Van long ago and took this picture of someone's ditch who had obviously landscaped it with native plants. And several examples from North Delta. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be 1 or 2 species. It can be multiple species, whatever you like. If you're feeling more ambitious, there is lots of advice available for creating an honest to goodness rain garden and getting water into it, usually from your roof, but maybe from your driveway or from the city street. These things are all available online. The Rain Garden Handbook for Western Washington. Seattle puts out a series called Rainwise. These are fact sheets that are very compact, concise, 2 pages long, and they tell you how to disconnect your downspout or make a rain garden. Soils for Salmon, another good organization, 12,000 rain gardens. They're more advanced than we are down in Seattle. These are just my tips, a checklist. If you were doing something at home, there might be just like 3 of these things that are relevant. If you're doing a major project, we've done some projects at churches, for example, if you belong to a church that has an opportunity. In fact, we're going to be doing one in the fall at a church in Vancouver. And you'll want to look at every single step in the checklist and use every step. But in a simple rain garden, it's just a reminder. And these are things that are frequent errors, I would call them, errors in rain gardens. So regardless of the details, the fundamentals are always the same. Water flows downhill. That's how you're going to get it into your garden. Plants and soil intercept the water and they sponge it up. The more and bigger the plants, the better they work at sponging all that stuff up and storing it in the ground. It's that simple. And here's one of my favorite maintenance crews, some teens from a maintenance party. We don't call them work parties anymore, but this was pre-COVID. And that is the end. I will stop the share here. Thank you very much for, the hook didn't come out and pull me off stage here at home. So let's see, stop share.
There we go.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Deborah. That was really fascinating.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I know it's long. I'm enthusiastic. I can't help it.
You should be enthusiastic about it because it's really important, and it's something that a lot of people probably don't realize. And it's great that you've been able to get cooperation from the city and the school board, et cetera, and get help with engineering and whatever.
It waxes and wanes depending on who's involved, but
yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine that would be the case.
But it's good.
But yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to see if I can find that chat thing again and see what questions we have. But I do have a question of my own because I'm really hopeless on the geography of the area. And usually I've helped out at the Delta Nats display at Watershed Park where the kids are putting the fry into the creek.
Right.
Where are those fry going?
Okay. I have some very sad news about the fry, but first I'll tell you the good news. So they go out Watershed Creek, they cross under Highway 91. They do that quite successfully. They go through some farm ditches and they go out into Boundary Bay at the Oliver Pump Station. And that's all very successful. Some years ago, Delta spent a lot of money redoing Oliver Pump Station so that it would be equally successful for them to come back in. But as often happens with engineering works, tides change, currents change, your engineering work changed something about water levels. And the way it stands now, the water levels are not such that many fish can get back into the system to spawn. So the first few years we saw spawners in Watershed Creek. It was so exciting, and we haven't seen those spawners in a long time. Delta has continued to do the fish release because of the educational value and the enthusiasm value of getting people to care about salmon and about their water courses and so on, streams and bays and everything. But until some kind of fix is done at Oliver Pump Station, we're not getting. There may be some returns, but we're not getting the returns that would have been expected because the habitat that was built in Watershed Creek, just upstream from the release site, is really nice habitat, nice spawner habitat. So we had been negotiating about this, but with COVID and budget restrictions and so on, plus the fact that Delta, bless their hearts, they spent a lot of money doing the right thing. They got experts to design things, but the best laid plans, the unexpected happens.
Yeah, that does happen for sure. Okay.
I see two from Annie in the chat. What constitutes a rain garden? So my definition for a rain garden is a garden that receives not only the rain that falls into it, but also rainwater runoff from a nearby impervious surface like a roof or a street, a parking lot. So that's the crux of it. It's not just the rain that falls into it, it's also receiving water from an impervious surface. Now I did muddy the waters a little bit, literally, showing Chalmers Park Rain Garden, which is receiving spring water. And that's an example of taking water that the city was really ill-advisedly pumping away or piping away and putting it into a rain garden. So rain gardens can be used also to solve drainage problems so that, instead of piping water away, like you're having trouble with your drain tiles or you're having trouble with a muddy patch in your garden and some expert comes and says, dig up the whole perimeter and redo the drain tiles, or they say, put a drain here and drain it away. Think maybe I might be able to solve this problem with a rain garden, with some landscaping that's going to deal with this nuisance water and at the same time accomplish something like some wildlife habitat, some bird habitat, insect habitat, whatever, or just fresh air. So, but the main definition is a rain garden receives runoff from an impervious surface.
Because we have weird water flow.
Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Was that sort of answered it? And then Annie had another comment, which is really interesting. Her comment to everyone remember that when I was at the hatchery at Tynehead, being told that after a dry spell and then heavy rain, it only takes an hour for the debris to appear at the hatchery.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that the rain just washes whatever off the pavement into storm drains, into the creeks, and whoa, it shows up in your creek, at your hatchery, on your beach.
Wow.
Joe Stevenson has a question here too. What are the implications or fines on the roof scrubbers that were recently in the news? Maybe he's referring to those roof scrubbers that put all the soap suds in.
Yeah, that was in Abbotsford, and I haven't heard the upshot of it. I think it's early days, but they're definitely investigating whether to charge a fine, and I think they sure should.
What was that?
Especially for the contractor. Maybe the homeowners wouldn't have known, but the contractor should know.
Absolutely.
That much soap running down a creek like that, it would kill everything in it. It would kill the bugs and fish and anything, you know, that.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And Molly Fuller.
Take it to task.
And they determined that it was Tide. They could actually pinpoint the type of detergent it was. It was Tide.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyone else have more questions?
I have another question. I've got an area in my front yard that actually pools. It was lawn between two very large maple trees. And it's a low spot that pools, and in the rainy season it'll stay with water in it for you know, a week at a time or whatever.
No.
I mean, it eventually drains away, but is there anything that I should be doing with that water?
Whereabouts do you live?
Ladner on Arthur Drive.
So you're fairly low lying. Yeah, so what I would say is it sounds like it's, you know, it's low lying. It could be a high water table there, or it could also be that over time that area has become so compacted that water isn't soaking in, because that does happen as well. For example, we see a lot in children in schoolyards, an area of lawn where kids have been playing for years. Even just raindrops on bare ground or on lawn can really compact the soil and literally squeeze the porosities out of the soil so that water has no place to go. So if that water, you haven't done anything with it yet, it hasn't caused flooding. If you wanted to try doing a rain garden, you could get the Seattle Rainwise fact sheet or use any of the other resources that are mentioned online. What they would essentially tell you is dig it down. If you can go as far as 18 inches, that's great, but 12 inches, dig out all of that soil. If it's sod, I would suggest don't dispose of the sod, but piece together the sod jigsaw puzzle style on other parts of your lawn. In other words, raise the rest of your lawn. And then bring in natural, you can either use your natural soil and wood chips or compost blended together and contour a kind of a basin rain garden, a shallow depression, and plant it up. And plant according to, are you a gardener?
Not really. I prefer the perennials, the native stuff that you don't have to buy.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, spireas would probably do well there because they can tolerate that kind of wet. So if you want a big, tall native Spirea douglasii, or if you wanted a lower variety, a nursery variety, they can tolerate that. I can tell you privately several plants that would tolerate that situation. And over time, it's not going to happen instantly, but over time, life has dealt you lemons. You're making lemonade, and that lemonade is going to be tastier and tastier over time, and the water will stand less long over time. Just by virtue of what's happening is the roots and the microbes are constantly opening new porosities in the soil. So it's fighting against the compaction, and also mulching with wood chips also fights against compaction.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd love to see a photo of it or drop by and visit you. I just do this, you know, for the love of it. So I'd be happy to look at it and
I'll let you know if I decide to go ahead with that.
yeah, it needn't be a whole lot of work. I mean, maybe you could just plant a willow right there and that would be it. Or a spirea. Don't dig anything, just plant a spirea.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Thanks,
So
Steph.
we have another comment from Annie that she's heard that one should either use a car wash or wash a car on the grass.
Yes, wow, Annie, you're full of good comments.
She always is.
That's absolutely true because we wash our car on our gravel strip actually because we don't have any grass at the front anymore. But a car wash drain goes to the sewage treatment facility. So no risk of soap suds getting into the storm sewer. But if you wash your car on the driveway, even if the soap suds don't reach as far as your nearest storm sewer, next time it rains heavily, that residue, that soap residue may well get to that storm drain. So yeah, that's really good advice. We have that advice on our signage, our interpretive signage.
Now we have a question here. And for all the times I've seen Osprey 877 on here, I still can't remember who that is.
I was wondering.
Pardon?
I was wondering.
Would Osprey 877 please identify herself? Jim, do you know who that is?
It's Colin and Stephanie Huggett.
Oh, Colin
And I
and Stephanie.
know there's some way I can, when I log in, I can change it to put that. I tried for about 10 minutes and gave up. So my apologies.
No,
That's who it is.
it's no problem. I should be able to remember because.
All right, I'll ask the question. Now I know.
Oh, there, I see Colin.
Save you reading it. I can
Yeah.
see how the rain garden is going to stop the flooding in the winter. When we get lots of rain, it's going to stop it going into the runoff. But how does it help in August when we've had a month and a half of drought? How does Cougar Creek benefit from that? Does the water eventually get to the creek, or is the main benefit of the rain garden just to prevent the flooding in the high
It's
rain?
exactly what you say. The water eventually gets to the creek. Now, of course, not all the rain, because as the water is seeping through the soil sponge underground, invisible to us, but heading sort of inexorably downhill, as it's seeping through the ground, organisms are making use of it, but some of it will reach the creek. And if you recall that photo I showed of the skunk cabbages in Cougar Canyon. So that's an example of a seepage. And when you're in Cougar Canyon, you can really see these seepages. You'll be walking along the trail and suddenly you'll see, wow, there's this wet patch. Where is it from? And water travels in mysterious routes underground. It's hard to map and it's costly to map. But when you see a seepage like that coming out of the side of a slope, you know, that's groundwater that's decided, oh, I'm coming to the surface here. Well, some of that groundwater doesn't come to the surface until it's right down in the creek. And it's actually seeping even up from underneath the creek. So you can think of the ground as like a sponge. And if you let all the water soak in, it's a sponge that's sopping wet. And you hold that sponge up in the air and the water at the bottom kind of drops off right away. So that would be your water close to the creek. Maybe in 24 hours, it's in the creek. But the water at the top of the sponge is going to, you know, stay dry longer. And it's gradually dripping away and making its way toward the creek. And as it goes, it's keeping your street trees and other vegetation healthy. So it may not get to the creek, but the whole thing is, it's like drinking a glass of water. You drink a glass of water and your body is just suffused with that water gradually. Whereas if you drank the water and it just went through a pipe from the entrance to the exit, well, you'd be dying of thirst. And that's, I'm afraid, what we're doing to the planet with our obsession with piped drainage of rainwater. Thank you for asking that, because that is really a the critical part of it for the summer.
I think what Colin was asking was what happens when there's no rain for extended periods of time.
Well, exactly, that's it. In the summer, there's no rain. So what keeps a creek flowing in the summer? The only thing that keeps it flowing, we don't have a snowpack. If you're in the North Shore Mountains, maybe a melting snowpack keeps it flowing. But if you're in North Delta, we don't have a snowpack. The only thing that keeps the creek flowing in the summer is the water that was banked underground in that soil sponge.
Oh, okay.
That is
That'll
the
keep,
source of the flow. That's it.
will that keep the creek with water flowing in it for months?
Well, this is the concern with climate change, that as we get more months of dryness, maybe not. And my biggest concern is the deep in-ground basements that we're getting, because those were only legalized in 2009, and it's only now that we're really picking up steam. And the thing is that the deep in-ground basements are vulnerable to being flooded. So by law, Delta law, they must have perimeter pumping, and any water, groundwater that gets close to that basement, they have to pump it up into, because the storm sewers are usually higher than the bottom of the basement, than the basement floor. So they have pumps around the perimeter, exterior perimeter of the basement, and they're pumping that water up to Delta's storm sewer, which might be 3 or 4 feet higher. And from there, that's being piped away. So the more basements we have, the higher the percentage of groundwater we're piping away. And the harder it is for creeks to survive the summer months.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really the crux of it. Yeah. I wish we'd build 3 stories. I mean, we have 3-story townhomes, so it would be much more environmentally sustainable to build 3-story single-family homes and have the secondary suite, whatever, above the garage or in the attic, or wherever people want to put it. Not to mention that would be a healthier place to live than underground.
Yeah, no kidding.
You Ladner folks and Beech Grove folks are lucky that you're fortunate that you don't have these deep in-ground things going in. They're just, the amount of concrete, the amount of soil excavation and disposal, the energy involved in pumping, the energy involved in creating all that concrete and trucking it onto site. It's not the way to deal with a climate emergency.
No. That's true enough. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's perfectly true. Anyways, anyone else have more questions? And then I'll just say thank you very much, Deborah. That was very, very interesting. I'm sure it's given people a lot.
Thank you.
It was superb. I learned.
Thank you for sticking with it.
Thank you.
Oh, it wasn't
And asking such
difficult
good
at all.
questions too. Thank you.